Yeah, one term that keeps coming up is plaque begets plaque, where like basically they showed the people that started with a higher amount of plaque added more plaque than the other people. Is that fairly true from what you know?
Yeah, and as from my knowledge of this field, that's common. You see that, and you look at other imaging studies that are not looking at keto, just imaging studies in general. The heterogeneity is something common. So you normally see just some people growing plaque really fast, some growing plaque really slow. And that's the same for any risk factor. If you look at a population of smokers, some people get lung cancer and are all messed up. Some people live to 100 and whatever and don't get lung cancer. So that's always the case. Some people just have bomb genetics and can handle it. So the heterogeneity is normal. The what were you asking about specifically? It was further than the heterogeneity.
And it was just the plaque begets plaque. The people that had the most
Yeah.
gained the most, and
Right.
so that matches what you know about that.
Yeah, you see that in other imaging studies that people who start out with more plaque tend to have faster plaque progression, which I think makes sense. Also, the plaque already being there is identifying people who have susceptibility to plaque being formed. So just by that logic alone, it doesn't surprise me. But yeah, it's something that's seen commonly. The other side of the equation, I don't know if you want to get into that, but the other side of the title that they had was plaque begets plaque and ApoB does not. And I think that's also been questioned on social media. I questioned that in my video. I think that was wildly overstated. I don't think that belongs, front and center. I think they ran an analysis that is very exploratory, and I think it's okay to run that analysis. I think it's okay to report it in the paper, but I think the prominence that was given to the result of that analysis, I don't think is appropriate. I think it was put front and center in the title and the summary of the paper, and the communication on social media kind of focused on that almost exclusively, and I don't think that's appropriate, because we have lower confidence for that result than the plaque progression which was the primary outcome. So anyway,
That was the messaging. Like that was the message that came out in the movie that I saw. Again, very well made movie, and I went back and watched it again to be sure to check this. But that was the main picture. Was the greater than 90% showed no progression based on the semi-quantitative data, the scoring system that I told you about, and then or that was also in the paper, but also that the correlation between ApoB and plaque progression, it was a scatter plot. It was a shotgun shot, and there was no association between the two. So that was the messaging, and that's again, you said very prominently, been kind of portrayed and shown out there. And so that was going to be my next question to you: is what do you think of the data that, or the message that shows that ApoB and or LDL cholesterol did not correlate with how much plaque somebody added? Meaning, if somebody had the 190 LDL cholesterol versus the 300, 400, there's no correlation there. Yeah, I was going to ask you how you responded to that. You don't think the evidence is as strong as maybe they've been leading with?
so before we get into that, I pulled up the paper real quick just to check that the TPS result. And I'm looking at the figure, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And then, yeah, there's another, the figure is a little strange, and I've had some people have questioned if there's something wrong with the figure. But the above the line of 0, so people who are leaning in the direction of progression, even looking at TPS, not looking at soft plaque, it looks like it's about at least 30 people. So even that 10% I find strange. I don't know where they got that, unless this graph is not correct. But looking at the graph in the paper, at least 30 people or so have a higher TPS, a class of plaque after than before. And again, remember, this is like 3 buckets, right? So I think it's important to realize you can have growth and still be in the same category, especially if your plaque is small to start with, which would be expected in this group because they're relatively young. They're 55 average, and they don't have any other risk factors. And they've been on this diet for like 5 years. So most of their life, the 50 years of their life, they had no risk factor or, very low risk. And then for a relatively short period of time, they have this sky-high cholesterol. The point is, if you start out with a very small amount of plaque, you're going to be in the small bucket. And even if your plaque grows, you might still be in the small bucket by the end of the year. That doesn't mean there wasn't growth, right? And because this is exponential with 10, 20 years, 30 years, by the time it jumps to the second bucket, that's a massive growth if you started out with very small plaque. Just to kind of contextualize. Okay, the LDL and ApoB result. Yeah, two main concerns with that, just to make it short, not to drag this on too long. One problem with that is that everybody has extremely high cholesterol to begin with. So even if we believe this result that a cholesterol of 200 versus 400 doesn't make a difference, it tells us nothing about going from normal to high, which is the main question, right? I want to know what happens if I go from normal cholesterol to high cholesterol, if that raises my risk of heart disease or not. If I get to 200 and 400, there's no additional increase. Okay, good to know, but doesn't answer the rest of the spectrum. So that's one concern. The other concern is that even looking at that result, the 200 to 400, and I've talked to statisticians and everything about this, there isn't a lot of confidence that they had the statistical power to detect a difference. And if you look at the ApoB graph, it trends up. It does not reach statistical significance. And I don't think we want to over speculate on things that are not significant. I don't think we want to say, oh, maybe it would be. We don't know. But a study with 100 people that was not powered for this analysis, it was not pre-registered. So this is not an analysis that the study was designed to support. So I think the confidence there is pretty low. And I think it would be okay to add that in the paper in the end, but not the level of PR that was put behind this message. I think that's concerning. And I think if in the future this is confirmed, I'll believe it, but I don't have a very high level of confidence that this will pan out.
Got it. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate that. I want to wrap this by asking kind of your own personal opinion. You know Dave. I know Dave. I consider him my friend. Adrian, Nick. I know all these guys, and I love their work and respect them. Like I said, Dave did an interview where he owned all of this and he apologized to the community and apologized for the mistakes that were made and the data wasn't included and the numbers didn't get out and all this stuff. And they're very smart people, and they're going to get the data out. They're going to find ways to have better messaging around this. That part of things, I think they're going to be able to recover and at least have more numbers, have better studies, ask different questions. Again, they're very smart people, and I think they're going to recover from this. Just in your own personal opinion, when I look at this, I see the problem as one more of like optics. Like the way this came out, it just doesn't look very good. And it's, again, in the community of the people that I know that are doing this, that are on the pages on Facebook and wanting these answers, they feel a little hurt and a little betrayed, and they kind of should. And so can something like this really just have a lot of negative implications in the future? Like, is there a risk that more research might not be done or more funding might not be done? Like, how do you see this, again, just in your own personal opinion, when something gets goofed up in a study like this? What are the implications that you could potentially see?
Yeah, I think it's a massive concern. I don't know about the funding. I mean, that's going to depend on people because this was funded by crowdsourcing, right?
Yeah.
By crowdfunding, by getting contributions from people. So that's going to depend on what people want to do. So I can't speak to that. But I can tell you that it's interesting because this community and scientists in general in this field, where I know that this community, a lot of times there's mistrust towards scientists in general. There's a lot of hesitation there. But on this, I think there was a lot of alignment, because what you're describing with these people feeling maybe frustrated or let down or what's going on, there was a level of outrage from scientists in general when they saw this, and from all camps. Actually, some of the most aggressive takedowns I saw were from people who eat low-carb diets or clinicians who prescribe low-carb diets, and were very angry, I think is fair to say, with how this was written. Not just the presentation on social media, that's a different chapter, but how this was written. Because to show a graph and then write something else, it's like some of these things are bizarre. Like you have a graph where most people are progressing, and then you say most are stable with one regressing. It's like, are you writing this for Stevie Wonder? Like, anyone who looks at this graph is going to know that that's not it's like almost a disrespect towards people's intelligence to write it that way in a scientific study. So yeah, and I don't want to like attack people personally. I've always had a civil relationship with Dave. I disagree vehemently with many of the ideas and how this is communicated on social media, and I was very clear about that in the video. I don't have any personal, issues with Dave. I don't wish him any harm, but we have very different ways of doing things. And so, yeah, I have a scientific concern on one hand that this going through peer review, that's another problem. The peer review was a massive failure. How do peer reviewers not pick up some of these things? How do the editors let this through? And then to add insult to injury, after many of these mistakes were pointed out and the authors either did not complain or even in some cases acknowledge that it was a problem. And in my interview with Dr. Budoff, for example, a lot of his responses were kind of reassuring me that this was being changed. A few days later, they issued a statement saying no changes are going to be made. So that version that everybody was tearing apart became the final version. No changes were made. Became the framed version in the scientific literature. I think from the scientific community, there's kind of disbelief that this is even going on, like the level of, I'd say, audacity of just, yeah, we've been pilloried for doing things this way. We admitted that these are mistakes, but we're not going to change anything. We're just going to leave it. That to me is the most shocking part. So at that level, at the scientific level, I think it's a dark kind of episode. At the public communication side, I think it's also extremely problematic, confuses people, sends people in the wrong direction. Now, and maybe it's a nice note to kind of wrap things up. I'm a very optimistic guy at the end of the day. And I think these things in the long run tend to rectify, and we tend to get things right in the long run. And I think there's a silver lining here. First of all, the fact that we're sitting here talking is a silver lining, because maybe before this study came out, you wouldn't have invited me to come on and people wouldn't have wanted to hear from me. I don't know. I can tell you that a lot of people from low carb and carnivore podcasts have been reaching out, which wasn't happening before. And I'm happy to go on those podcasts. I actually like it more because I'm not preaching to the choir, and I like kind of the different ideas. And so that I think is a silver lining, the fact that people are talking and hearing what other people are saying. I hope this cultivates some healthy skepticism, that people question everyone, question me, like no one is infallible. Everyone has their biases, everyone has their failures. Listen to what people say, but then investigate, right? This is life and death. It's the #1 cause of death in humans worldwide is heart disease. It's not a joke. So somebody on the internet tells you something, including here, including me, listen to that, but investigate. Do due diligence, right? Don't just trust. I know that's tough, but it's a vital skill nowadays.